In the winter of 2014, the question of whether Ukraine would enter economic cooperation more closely with Western Europe or with Russia led to shakeups in government, clashes between government forces and separatists, an incursion by Russian forces, and the de facto annexation of Crimea, to which the United States and Western European countries responded with economic sanctions. These events led some to speculate that this could be the beginning of a new Cold War between East and West. After a year of extensive diplomatic efforts, what is the situation now, and where is it headed? Dr. Michael Slobodchikoff of Troy University's Department of Political Science moderates the following panel on Ukraine, a new Cold War, beginning with a review of events from 2013 to the present.
In November of 2013, then President Yanukovych of Ukraine was deciding whether or not to sign an association agreement with the EU. He decided at that time not to sign it, and this led to widespread protests in Kiev. At that time, Russia was pushing Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement and to become closer to Russian interests. What followed was a series of protests, and eventually Yanukovych was gotten rid of and a new government was set up in Kiev. What followed was Russia was not happy with those results, invaded Crimea, and took over Crimea as a new region in Russia, protecting its interests of the Black Sea Fleet. At that time, also in the southeast portion of Ukraine, a civil war broke out, and we are now still in the throes of that civil war, although there have been ceasefires signed since. For example, in February of 2015, the Minsk Agreement was signed, and basically what happened there was that they decided that Ukraine would give more autonomy and more power to certain of the breakaway regions in exchange for control over the border between Russia and Ukraine, among other things. Currently, that ceasefire is holding, although shakily at the best, but the civil war it can resume at any time. To discuss this issue today, I am very pleased to have a panel of experts. On my right is General Walter D. Gavon, a native of Safford, Alabama, who earned his master's degree from Troy University. He retired in 2014 as a Major General in the U.S. Air Force and served as Vice Commander of Air University in Montgomery, where he oversaw all of the Air Force's higher education, with the exception of the Air Force Academy, including the Community College of the Air Force, the world's largest community college system. He has also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of U.S. Global Assistance Programs and as Commandant of the U.S. Air Force Institute of Technology in Dayton, Ohio, the Air Force's Graduate School of Engineering and Management, as well as its Institution for Technical Professional Continuing Education. He is also a member of the Dartmouth Conference and Council on Foreign Relations. To my left is Dr. Margaret Nowinska, who is an assistant professor of history at Troy University. She received her PhD from the George Washington University in January of 2010. She has an MA in International Affairs from the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and a BA in International Politics and Economics from Middlebury College. She is also a Fulbright Scholar and a Boren NSEP Fellow. She has published as well as presented her research in the United States and around the world. Dr. Nowinska has been working closely over the years with the Cold War International History Project of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. She has worked in translating archival documents and partaking in international workshops and conferences organized by the Cold War International History Project. she is also currently working on 2 books, which will be published shortly. Myself, my name is Dr. Michael Slobodchikoff. I am an assistant professor here at Troy and have published 2 books on Russian foreign policy in the post-Soviet region. My first book is Strategic Cooperation: Overcoming the Barriers of Global Anarchy, which was published in 2013. And my most recent book is Building Hegemonic Order Russia's Way: Rule Stability and Predictability in the Post-Soviet Space, which was published in 2014. I specialize in relations between Russia and the former Soviet space, and am a regular contributor for Russia Direct, and often serve as an analyst on Russian and relations with Ukraine for the BBC World News, as well as Voice of Russia Radio. So welcome today. We are very pleased to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to state again that the Ukrainian crisis is indeed, while it is currently in the state of a ceasefire, it is a tinderbox waiting to happen again, and has implications for not just Ukraine itself, but has implications for the world over. And so I'd like to start and ask General Givan a question, and that is specifically, given your background in the Air Force, how much does the current situation resemble the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States?
Well, certainly anyone who was involved in the Cold War will see things that are familiar. For example, some of the exercises that are currently taking place. I was a fighter pilot charged with protecting the inter-German border at that time. We routinely scrambled to intercept the Warsaw Pact fighters or aircraft that might be penetrating that border. Similarly, now you see more and more of these sort of exercises that happen not just in Europe or around Europe, but also in our territorial airspace here in the United States. And we see familiar things of fighters intercepting bombers or long-range aircraft again. Those all remind one of the Cold War. But in no way is the scale and the intensity anything like what the Cold War was. When I was in Europe, you could hardly drive a short distance without coming to another concentration of troops, of air base of some kind, all of us united in one effort with a coherent strategy to counter any Soviet or Warsaw Pact aggression into there, an exercise schedule and scale that was massive and intense, and throw into this mix nuclear weapons at all levels trained at one another. We're not at that at this point. So certainly, although there are elements of resemblance, there's no way that we're at the scale and the intensity of what we had during the Cold War.
Okay. And given the given the training sessions that have happened between now NATO moving closer to Russia and Russian training exercises, what is the likely of an accident happening that would escalate the conflict while we now don't see anything like we saw in terms of scale for the Cold War? How likely is it that an accident could occur and we could find ourselves there very quickly?
There's certainly that probability. In fact, when I was talking with my Russian counterparts as part of my participation in the Dartmouth conference, an unofficial exchange between a Russian and an American delegation, that was exactly the point that I made, that we have these opportunities now presenting themselves where accidents can happen. We have people who, although they've been well trained, or have not been used to doing this as we were doing it routinely during the Cold War. And so there's every potential for something bad to happen. We saw something similar to this, if you recall, when a Chinese fighter was intercepting one of our surveillance aircraft, a Navy P-3 Orion, and actually hit the aircraft, crippling it, and the fighter itself crashed. We don't need anything like that. Like you said, something like that could certainly serve as a spark to ignite a larger conflict.
Good. Okay. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Gnowinska and ask her that as General Gavin said, that the conflict is not necessarily a new Cold War. The scale is not the same. Does that mean that this is more of a regional security issue, or could this become a new Cold War?
Well, as a Cold War historian, I have to answer no. It's not a new Cold War. It's not a new global conflict. It's more of a regional conflict, and I'll explain briefly why in the limited time that we have. Well, the Cold War was a competition, was a global competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that really started in post-World War II Europe. It spread throughout. What was the competition really about? It was about nuclear supremacy. It was for military, political, economic, social, cultural influence globally. The competition created a very clear bipolar structure that represented two competing visions of modernity. You had communism on the one hand, and you had capitalist democracy on the other. So it was a very ideological kind of a struggle. Within that bipolar structure, we also had ways to challenge it. For example, the Sino-Soviet split. There's this agreement between between China and the Soviet Union that exacerbated relations within the communist world in the 60s that lasted into the 80s. Then you also have movements like the non-aligned movement led by India, by Egypt and former Yugoslavia that wanted to challenge the bipolar system, but they were not able to. None of these movements, none of these developments were able to do that, not even decolonization that was taking place in Africa. So that bipolar structure kind of really remained. And it fell apart in 1989, early 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union. What we now have is more of a multipolar world in which the United States is still one of the strongest countries. So is the PRC, the People's Republic of China, that has an economic power, that has military power. Russia clearly, to me, remains a major player. It does remain a major player, has a strong military power, but it does not nearly have the means and the ability to influence the world globally as it did during the Cold War through proxy wars that we have seen in let's say, Vietnam, Korea, and conflicts in Africa through covert operations. So they don't have that capability. So from the historical perspective, what I see is more of a regional conflict. And that regional conflict, again, is not an ideological struggle. It's not a struggle between two different systems, but is a struggle that is brought about by Russia's geopolitical interests that were brought about also by, I would say, Russia's deep-seated fear and insecurity of the West to some degree, and also brought about by Ukraine's decision to join in or express interest in joining NATO and in joining the EU. So what you see is more of a regional type of a conflict. Who are the major players? Who are the major players? Well, Russia is a major player, so is Ukraine, and so are some of the EU countries. And they're not the new EU countries, those are the older countries, Germany and France. And they're trying to figure out the best way of how to resolve the conflict. So it became much more of a regional security issue than a global. I don't see it becoming as global as we may make it look.
Okay. Okay, good. And yet, despite this, I'd like to say that we're closer to an open conflict with Russia than we have been at any time since the collapse of the Cold War. U.S. hegemony is being challenged in many places, including the PRC, including other areas. Our dominance in the rest of the world is being challenged. Our cooperative efforts with many other countries are being challenged. So this remains a great challenge for the U.S. to overcome. And Russia has certainly been challenging us at this stage. So I think I would ask both of you, and I'll start with you, General Gavin, that sooner or later this has to be resolved. We can't keep this as a fermenting Cold War, so to speak, or even a frozen regional conflict. And so we have to come up with solutions. And I know there have been several efforts to try and ease the tensions between the United States and Russia. One of those is the Dartmouth Peace Conference. Would you mind discussing the conference and how these efforts could help to resolve the Ukrainian conflict?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Quick history lesson on the Dartmouth Conference.
Yes.
It actually grew out of the Cold War. And so even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, members of the Dartmouth Conference from Russia and the United States were actually meeting. And when they asked for instructions about what to do in light of what was going on, they were encouraged to keep meeting. So this structure of an unofficial delegation, but many of whose members have been part of government or security or industry at some time in an official capacity, meeting together gives an open channel of communication that's informal in some ways and can very much act as a forum where ideas can be aired that would never see the light of day in any kind of an official forum. And most of the people who participate in the Dartmouth Conference still have very significant contacts within government, industry, the armed forces. And so they're able to call upon that so that they're not isolated completely. And yet they can engage and talk about things. I can tell you that what we've tried to do is continue a dialogue, find areas where it looks like cooperation is possible and productive, that we can show small steps towards continuing cooperation in important areas, space being one of them, for example, but also tackle some of the tougher issues too. We actually started talking about some arms reductions and how we might keep those efforts going. And even floating, very informally, grand proposals about how the current situation might be resolved in some way, even if it's only the broad outlines. And these sessions are useful not just for the communication that occurs, but they're useful because we get to know one another. We get to understand one another. And both sides are taking back what they've heard, what they've expressed, and reporting back so that we know, even though it's an unofficial exchange, official channels are being influenced by this.
Great, great. Dr. Gnowinska,
Yes.
so we just heard from General Gavan about the individual level, the sub-government level, how we can ease tensions. And can we see efforts being made at a more regional level, as you discussed it being a regional conflict, while we focus on the United States and Russia? We could also talk about regional efforts at resolving this. Do you see any efforts there?
Yes, I do. What General Gavan was just talking about, you were talking still at kind of a bilateral level between the larger countries, between the what they used to be called superpowers or the greater powers. But the conflict being regional, I mean, you want to involve your neighbors, you want to involve countries that are surrounding Ukraine. And only recently did we have some very interesting proposals, and we're still not sure exactly where the solution is going. But when the new president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, when he was elected, he gave the equivalent of the State of the Union address in Poland in early August of this year, and he did not mention Ukraine. That really upset the Ukrainian parliament. It really upset Poroshenko. And only later, a few weeks later, before the Polish president's visit to Berlin, did he mention officially that there should be something a little more regional done about the conflict. What he really suggested was that in addition to what we call the Normandy format, where you have France and Germany involved trying to resolve the crisis, there should be new NATO members, or newer NATO members, like Poland, a neighbor of Ukraine, and perhaps even others involved. What he suggested also, what is very interesting to me, that he said that it should also involve the United States, that we don't have at the moment. That message, that idea was very warmly received. It was very positively received on the Ukrainian side, that is looking for protection, that is looking for more allies, for more support from the region. Only as of Friday or Saturday, just a couple of days ago over the Labor Day weekend, there was a special envoy from the Polish government to Kiev who spoke directly with President Poroshenko. And through those talks, Poroshenko invited the president to visit Ukraine and to talk things out. What was very interesting about that proposition also was that it's not just about Poland, Ukraine, it's also trying to involve Lithuania. So what the president is thinking, what Poroshenko, Ukrainian president, is thinking, he's thinking of involving current NATO members, Lithuania and Poland, in a deeper technical military cooperation without Ukraine being officially part of NATO. We don't know what the answer is from the Polish government yet. We don't know where this is going, but I think this is one of the additional channels, one of the additional ways to perhaps decrease the tensions and see whether we can find some kind of a solution by involving smaller nations and the neighboring nations who have very vested interest in not having a civil war, not having a failed state right next to their borders.
Okay, good. We have limited time left, but in the limited time left, I'd like to throw a curveball at the panelists and ask, you know what they say about predictions, they're doomed to fail.
Yes.
But that having been said, do you have any predictions for the conflict in the coming months?
In the coming months, I think you'll see, I hate to extrapolate current trends,
Right.
but I'll say, I think you'll see a little bit more of the same. It's good to see small progress around the periphery of things, small initiative things going there. Russia still continues to posture as they're doing now, flexing muscles a little bit in Syria, other places like that. I think it's going to be important that the United States, other major powers who are involved in this, don't react or overreact to some of the things that I think the Russians are doing to feed their own nationalistic sort of population, what they're trying to do with the population, mobilize the population in terms of opinion, especially at a time when it's pretty economic hard times are hitting Russia. So I don't see anything dramatic happening. I'm hoping nothing dramatic happens.
Well, for me, we always hope for any conflict going out of control, but I'm both pessimistic and I'm a little optimistic. Well, I think what Poroshenko is dealing with right now, domestically especially, I mean, he's being challenged by his own people, and that's why we always have the domestic policy, foreign policy always, in my view, go hand in hand. So what he has to do, in my view, what may happen in the next few months, as I said in my earlier remarks, gather as much support as possible from the neighboring countries, United States included, perhaps throw out lots of different ideas of how to resolve this conflict. Where the threats are coming, they are more coming from within Ukraine. And we've seen what happened with the bomb go off in Kiev. It was just a week ago when you have the Ukrainian nationalists. So it could really, I'm just hoping that the regional option, in addition to what General Givan was talking about, will give us some time to think about solutions. But the domestic threat for Poroshenko staying in power, I think is very real, because we may not see him. We may not see him in a couple months. If we ever resume this conversation, we may be talking about a different president.
And that's why I remain pessimistic about this conflict. I think that General Givan is probably correct that all things remaining equal, will see the status quo continue. But I think that internal elements are gathering. They're unhappy with Poroshenko and his leadership. They don't want to give more autonomy to the Southeast. They are pushing and calling that capitulation to Russia, and so they will push him more. It actually, ironically, becomes in his interests to resume the civil war, because then those elements will go fight in the Southeast and not be pushing him in Kiev. And so I could see a scenario where Ukraine will devolve again into civil war, and then unfortunately it could tear the state apart. I hope for the best. I really hope that things continue to improve and that they actually get resolved and the tensions are lessened, because I think that that's what's necessary for the survival of the Ukrainian state.
And it's also in the interest of neighboring countries from
Absolutely.
the economic standpoint, from
Absolutely.
a national security standpoint. We have seen that you have newer members of NATO asking for a lot more United States commitment. Military bases included on what is now periphery of the EU.
Yeah, you've seen
Yes.
deployment of F-22s to the Baltics, for
Right.
To the
example.
Baltics
and,
as
Right.
well,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So-
Well, I think it's in everyone's interest that the situation gets resolved. It's in the United States' interest, in Russia's interest, and certainly in Ukraine's interest. But one thing that we know now is to expect the unexpected with this situation. And so I have a feeling that we will probably be gathering again
Yes.
before too long to discuss new information and to discuss this. So I want to thank you very much
welcome.
for your expertise and for joining us today. And thank you very much
My
for a
pleasure.
wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.